Yeah, welcome to the Fuse Life podcast. This is episode 160, and my guest today, like many other guests, is a hidden man who's been very influential in many things around the world. And I had a beautiful conversation with him probably a month ago, a month and a half ago, around what's happening in church, leadership, and communities, and learning about his heart and what he has seen. I know that this is going to be a powerful conversation. So, Bob Smart, I just want to thank you, Bob, for making time today just to hang with us and share your heart with us.
No problem. It's great.
So, we just got on the subject of ultra marathons because Bob is a fit man, I am learning, and has done ultra marathons, which is like 40, 50, 60 miles, which is around 100 Ks through the night. And yeah, so Bob, my story, I last week just decided to walk one just for fun. I was like, I think it'll be good for my mind. I'll walk 42 Ks and it's not pressure because I'm walking, it's fine. So then I thought I'll put a vest on, a 10 kg vest on. So I put that on to make it a bit more challenging. And then I thought I'll do the first half in barefoot shoes to make it a bit challenging because I'm walking. And yeah, my ankles and toes got wrecked and mangled 20 Ks in. And I limped the rest of the 20 Ks. And it took me a long time, like just under 12 hours to finish because I was hobbling by the end. But it was
Yeah,
such a great experience that yeah, there is a bug there, there is something there. And so I'm so blown away by your 100K experiences.
I did one in Canada, and at the beginning of the race, they tell you to check the road before you cross the road, make sure no
Yeah.
traffic's coming. So they do that bit, but then they go, if you come across a black bear, don't look it in the eye. Step off the path, be very quiet, let it go past. If you see a brown bear, make yourself big, shout at it, and it will move off the path. If you see a mountain cougar, it's too late. So, so then you're running along, and I come from Oxford in the UK, and I've never seen a brown or a black bear. So I realized I would need to interview them both beforehand to figure out if they're a black or a brown bear, figure out what to do.
Wow, man. Did you run into anything?
I didn't, but the person behind me did. He stopped to take a stone out of his shoe, and a bear crossed the path. So he had to wait 20 minutes for this bear to make his way across the path. And then when he got
Wow.
into the checkpoint, he got timed out because
Oh
he'd wasted
no.
20 minutes. He said, "But it was a bear." And I said, "Yeah, it's life in Canada. Get used to it."
Wow.
Yeah.
Fascinating. So, Bob, maybe you can just tell us a little bit about what you're doing currently, a little bit about yourself, and then we'll flow with the subjects.
Yeah. So the last job that I was doing was managing director of an augmented reality company. And the augmented reality was the headsets that people put on, but also the software that you delivered to those headsets. And it is mind blowing what's coming over the horizon. So we were helping doctors, for instance, or surgeons who would hold a plastic scalpel and then operate on someone 100 kilometers away, and a real scalpel would open them up. And it's
What?
all remotely. So they could see through the glasses the patient. We could also put information onto the glasses that the tumor is 1.5 centimeters down. It's only 4 centimeters, four whatever's across. And so they're able to be more accurate with it.
Wow.
So could help with that. And then with architects, you could put the glasses on, go to the build site and see the building as they intended it to be. So just a fictitious augmented reality building. That enabled them to turn the building if they wanted to in the planning stage, or change the color of the rendering on the building, all without having any impact. They could go to levels as well where they check the wiring, making sure that the tunnels, the tracks for the wiring are all going to be open. So you can see all of that in augmented reality. The funniest one that I think is the military were using it. So you could put an augmented addition onto a rifle or a gun, and it would fire an augmented reality bullet, 200 meters, 400 meters, whatever. But then they developed it that your colleague could put on a jumpsuit that was all wired up, stand 200 meters away, and you could shoot them with a virtual reality bullet. So my South African friend said, well, I'll put the suit on, no problem. And he put it on, walked 200 meters away, and they said, we can turn it from 0 to 100 in terms of the impact. And he said, listen, I'm South African, turn it to 100. And they said, no, 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 we'll put it at 60 and see how you feel. So 200 meters away, someone fires a pretend bullet, an augmented reality bullet, but the system tracked the accuracy of the bullet. It hit him on the shoulder, knocked him off his feet. He was lying around on the ground thinking that he'd broken his ribs, and it was just a pretend bullet. So this for the military, for security people is fantastic because it's nearly a zero cost exercise, whereas you could be spending a lot of money training people. So
Yeah.
augmented reality is coming over the horizon big time. Lots of people taking an interest in it.
Wow. That's fascinating. How long were you in that industry? How long were you in that space?
So I got asked to leave the previous company I was in and join this augmented reality company, and promised that in 2 or 3 years we'd be able to sell the business and it would make a retirement fund. But actually, when I joined the company after about 3 or 4 months, I found out they'd made some mistakes in the way that they'd been purchasing the stock and were $2 million in debt.
Mm,
So I had to spend the next 6 months resolving that problem. But in the end, the only way to resolve it was to make 75% of the staff redundant to
wow.
lower the costs. And because I was messing around with people's lives like that, I made myself redundant in that process and then
Wow.
left a core team running the business.
Man, that's amazing. Um, I'd love to know if we go right back to maybe your younger days, like because you're so fascinating in the sense that there are so many things you've been involved in.
Yeah.
You've been like your track record has all kinds of things that you can't really see a mesh in, really. But I'd love to know your journey with the Lord, like when that began, how that began in the early days.
Yeah, I went to a boarding school when I was a kid. So around 10 years old through to 17, 18, I was away from home in a boarding school. And one of the things a boarding school does is it makes you, on a positive side, it makes you independent. You
Mm,
have to stand on your own 2 feet. There's nobody to go back to in the evening and say, that was a rubbish day. I don't like maths or whatever it might be.
mm,
You just have to stand on your own 2 feet. So that's a positive, it makes you independent. And negative is it makes you independent. It's the flip side of the same coin.
sure. Yeah.
So sometimes it makes you a little bit, say, tunnel focused. But that was who I was. That's who I grew up as. And I grew up wanting to be a phys ed teacher, a PE teacher. He was my hero at school. So that's what I did. And whilst I was still at school, he was teaching me how to teach. So I would take 15-year-olds on a Wednesday afternoon for 2 hours of rugby or football, whatever it was. So I was learning whilst at school. Then I got a job teaching um, in a secondary school, and I was looking at the way that gymnastics was being taught. And I don't know if it was true for you, but back in the day when you came into the gym, it was like a military exercise. So the kids would come in, they'd all be dressed, you'd check their kit, they'd then sit down in rows, 6 rows maybe, And the first person would stand up, run to the mats, do a forward roll or a head spring or something like that, and run round to the back and sit down.
Hmm.
But when you analyzed it, actually 80% of the time, the students were inactive. They were sitting waiting for their turn. And also, you'd put a limit on success because only a few people could do a head spring or a neck spring. And so you had a very toxic environment where the kids in the gym were not very active and they knew they were coming up to a point of failure.
Mm.
So what we did was we switched it. So if you and I walked into the gym together, we would pair up and we would nominate one of us to be the coach and one to be the student. So you would then be coaching me how to do a forward roll or how to do a balance across a beam. And you'd have a card with instructions that enabled you to coach. Then I, as a teacher, would come round to the group. I'd come to the student and say, good job. You are working so hard at this. And then I'd come to their best mate, who's the coach, and say, hey, how can you improve what they're doing? You look on the card. Oh, yeah, they're not landing with 2 feet. Okay, sort it out. So your best mate became your coach, and the PE teacher became the encourager in the classroom.
Mm.
But I think what it was seeding in my head was trusting students, trusting that these people could come up with the answer if you gave them the right context. So when
Mm.
they came into the context, every piece of equipment was out in the gym. They picked up their cards, they went to the right piece of kit, and they worked their butt off for 40 minutes or an hour, however long the lesson was. And they came out of it exhausted. So
Mm.
our productivity level went up, the amount of trust we give to students went up, and the way they perceived the teacher changed. And
Wow.
that was a very significant piece in my background, in my training.
Yeah. And so was that something that you came up with? It was your like your idea. You saw that, you saw the problem, saw the need, and facilitated that solution?
Yeah, I worked with a university lecturer, and he actually got a PhD out of it. Um, but
Wow.
he would video every lesson I taught for a year. And then at the end of every day, I'd go into the university and he would analyze the tapes and show me where I could improve in my approach. So
Wow.
it was, an incredible opportunity. I'm so glad that I did that. So I did
Yeah.
that for 4 years of doing that product or that
Mm.
approach. Ended up doing demonstration lessons around the UK of how to do this sort of thing. But at the same time, I was watching the students coming into secondary school and realized partly that we were teaching them how to behave in school. And, they either did or they didn't. But then when they went home, some of them were going home to some really, really tough scenarios. So after teaching for a total of 8 years, 4 years doing that product or project, I gave up teaching and went up to London to train how to do church planting, how to change communities. So I spent a year in London, sort of retraining myself to look more at communities rather than just phys ed. I wanted to understand how communities worked.
Interesting. So how do you end up in church planting? Like during this time as a teacher, are you already walking with God? You already know God? Was that part of
Yeah,
your upbringing?
I'm a
Yeah.
Christian just before I went into teaching because we got married. My wife was a devout Christian, and she looked at me and said, Bob, I can't marry you. I said, why not? She said, well, you're not Christian. I said, listen, I'm English, I'm British. We have the Queen. I stand up when she comes on TV. I'm as Christian as it can be. She said, no, 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 no. It doesn't work like that. I said, what do you mean it doesn't work like that? She said, it's not to do with the culture. it's to do with having a personal relationship with Jesus. I said, well, yeah, when I was at boarding school, I went to church twice on a Sunday. No, 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 no. Okay, we're back.
Yeah, you cut off for a bit there. So you were
Yeah,
saying you were
we
at
were
boarding school?
boarding school, went
Yep.
to church twice on a Sunday. And she said, no, that's not what it's about. And one day I was listening to some recovering drug addicts, and they said how personal relationship with Jesus had changed them. And it had a big impact on me. I suddenly realized what they were talking about. And I remember going upstairs and saying, God, if you're real, you've got to prove yourself to me. And over the next period of time, Jesus, became a reality to me. So I became a Christian before I started teaching. I got married as a Christian with a personal relationship with Jesus, um, which is thrilled about. You know, it was like going through a door into a completely different world. I saw things differently. And I think that's what sowed the seed that I could have stayed in teaching and could have continued doing what I was doing, but something was niggling at me to say, there's more to it. I want you to be involved in more than just teaching.
Mm.
It's not to say people don't get a call into teaching, but my particular piece was, there's a little bit more I want you to do. So
Yeah.
I went and did a year's training course, and it was in a very charismatic church based up in London. And they started teaching that the God of the Bible, or the Jesus of the Bible, was still active today. And I go, well, hang on, what do you mean by that? They said, well, he's still doing miracles today. And I found that really troubling, you know, because I
Mm.
just got my head around, you know, having a living relationship with Jesus. And now they're saying he's active today. So I saw one or two things in big services where I thought, wow, that's incredible. You know, there were people that were being healed of physical ailments. I just thought this is amazing. So I remember again going and making a contract with God and saying, I remember saying to God in my prayer, listen, God, I'm willing to put myself in the situation where the only way out is for you to heal the person in front of me. But
Wow.
I need to confess to you, I've got no skills in this. You know, I have no clue how to do this. So off I went. And we were doing street preaching and that sort of thing. Little crowds would gather. Then a lady came forward and said that she's got a problem with her leg. And I heard myself say, I'll pray for you and it'll get better. Thinking, you know how your head works on different levels at the same time? Part of me
Sure.
was going, oh, that was bold. And another part was thinking, why on earth did you say that? So this lady sat down on a bench and I lifted her ankles, and you could see that one leg was significantly shorter than the other. So I just said, Lord Jesus, just make this leg grow. And in my hand, the leg grew maybe an inch, 3/4 of an inch, just came down, feeling it come down. And she stood up and just walked away saying, yeah, I'm better. This is amazing. Another time, a deaf guy came out of the crowd and said, well, I'm deaf in one ear, can't
Mm.
hear a thing. So he said, well, prove it. And he put his hand over his good ear, and it was true, he couldn't hear what we were saying. So again, I heard myself saying these very bold things. My Jesus can make that better. And
Yeah.
then the insecure side of my head was going, what on earth have you said now? And I said, well, I'll pray for you. But my logic was still working in these two dimensions. So part of me, I put my hand over his ear and prayed that God would open it.
Mm.
My doubting side, I can remember trying to screw my finger a little bit deeper into his ear, hoping that somehow that would open up his ear.
Mm.
After 30 seconds, I took my hand away and he could hear.
Wow.
He just heard. And he walked away as well, just saying, wow, that was amazing. So for me, the year in London changed my relationship with Jesus as well, that it was compassion for the community. But I was beginning to realize that we had the authority, if you like, or the equipment or the gifts to actually make changes in these communities. So at the end of
Wow.
my year, I went back to my city and looked at my city and saw that the city isn't homogeneous. It's not the same from left to right or top to bottom. But actually, when you study a map of a city or you walk in the city, you can see it's made up of very, very small communities,
Mm,
often divided by a fast road, often divided by perhaps a river or a woodland or a parkland or a housing type. And actually, these communities are probably no more than 2 or 3 thousand people. And that sparked in me a realization that instead of asking people to come to church and travel across their communities or different communities to get to our building, we needed to put the church within their communities.
mm,
Small churches, if you think about it as an individual, how many people can we witness to? It's not that many. It's 50,
mm,
100 people maybe that we can actually influence. So the seed thought was, let's put small living churches into these communities with a mission to transform that community. So what I did then was I looked, we had like 9 or 10 large churches or uh, active churches in the city. And I said to them, why don't you send to me people, got to be older than 20, but they can be up to 40, 50, to me for a year, and I will train them how to transform a community. So fortunately, it was in the 90s. The church leaders in the city went, do you know what? This sounds really good. We've got people in mind that we can send. So we built this college, if you like, and these people would come from many different churches across the city. And then what I did on day one was put them into teams made up of people from different churches. So they weren't all from the same Baptist church or C of E or whatever, but mix them up deliberately. And then I'd say to them, okay, you've got a team of 6 or 7 people now. On the first day, we'd put them in the teams. In the afternoon, I'd send them to one of these small geographic areas in the city. I say to them, I want you to go there. I want you to transform the community, and I want you to plant a church there. So they'd go off on Monday afternoon, go and find the community probably they'd never been to before in their lives. And then when they came in on Tuesday to the training session, man, they had questions like, how on earth are we going to do this? What do you mean we've got to what do you mean by transform? What does that mean? What does a church look like when it's predominantly made up of young people in this community? So all the questions came out.
mm,
And that was what my goal was rather than give people the answers, I wanted to generate questions in people. I
mm.
wanted to put these students of mine in a context that forced questions out. So when they came in Tuesday, Wednesday, and onwards, they were always full of questions. Hey, we just come across in our tower blocks, there are old ladies in there that haven't been out for 2, 3 weeks. They're locked there. So I said, well, okay, how are you going to resolve that? And they began working out schemes where they'd go into their churches and find uh, ladies who are in their 60s, and then they'd go and introduce them to the ladies in the high-rise apartments, and they'd just go in and chat with them, make them a cup of tea, be friends with them. And then what happened was the old lady themselves said, why are you doing this? And that question is a great door opener for us to share our values with people.
Yeah. Yeah. Wow, I got so many questions just before that. Is there someone like knocking something on the corner or running or something like that? Was
There is
there
a
a
noise in this building. Yeah. I don't know
yeah,
what it is.
okay, okay. Um so I find this fascinating because right, most of us are taught when you come to a church, you join a church, you sit down, become part of a congregation, and then you may go witnessing, in some teams, and then you come back and it's always about the building. And here
Yeah,
you
it's
are
strange.
talking about the community and the city and people going in there and they don't seem equipped, right? Because you're saying that the questions come up on the job, so to speak, and we walk through it. What are your thoughts on why that's not more common? Because it's obviously sounds so much more effective and healthy and like what Jesus did, right?
I think it goes way back, to where we had monasteries that were developing priests, and then they'd send the priests out, and then the priests would build a church around them. That's very simplified. But when you look at a church as well, it's not really structured to do this sort of innovation. Um, if you look at it, let me simplify it, but a church is actually a pyramid, or can be seen as being a pyramid, where the pastor, the chief pastor, is sitting at the top. Now, most of us have been geared up to work our way up through the organization, whether it's at school or in the classroom, whether it's in work for sure. You're sort of geared to understanding how structures work. So when you come into a church, one of the first things you notice is that there is this pyramid system. And one off being the pastor as being one of the elders, for instance. But you analyze it a little bit more and realize that actually doing certain things will accelerate your course, your route up through the church. So one of the key things is going to the prayer meeting. That's a big tick in the box. That's a good thing to go and do. But then you look beyond that and realize, actually, running a home group, that's a real killer thing. If you can get yourself a home group, you go up a fair few levels in the status within the church, and you get to meet once a month, once every other month with the elders. So now you're getting a direct influence into the eldership group just because you've analyzed the structure of the church and you've played your cards. Now, I'm being, a bit stroppy in the way that I'm saying that, but I think it's true when you look in. If you want to fast track your way through and get to the top even quicker, learn to play the guitar. Become a worship leader, and it's like fast track,
Mm.
because then you get probably face-to-face meetings with the pastors saying, hey, I'm planning to talk about this this month and I need music to align people with that, and so on. So the way that we're structured in many churches, it's not true of all churches, is that we're building the church, and we're not really thinking about how we influence the community. So there's I think, a need for a different sort of mindset that's looking primarily outside the church and
Mm.
then allowing the community to actually shape the church in quite a dramatic way, or possibly in quite a dramatic way.
Wow. And so this initiative that you're talking about where you sent these leaders out, this is how many years ago now?
So that was in the 90s.
Okay.
Um, and what happened off the back of that was a guy from South America came across to the college. We were training about 200 people at the time, and he watched and he saw what we were doing, how we'd broken down the city into these small communities, how we were targeting particular communities, how we were mixing people from different churches to have an impact. So it wasn't like, the Baptist church is expanding. It was like, wow, there's a new church there and it doesn't look like us.
Mm.
So he was looking at that and said, okay, we need you to come across to Latin America and teach us how to do this. I was just amazed. I thought everybody was doing that. I was
Mm,
in my own bubble, if you like.
mm,
And so when someone comes and says, "Could you come to South America and do this?" Well, yeah, of course it can. I'm surprised you're not doing it already, because it's not difficult. So for the next 8 years, I commuted to Latin America, and we worked in multiple cities across Latin America, in most countries across Latin America, including the Caribbean. Um, and typically, what would happen is the organization that we were working with would set up a vision casting meeting where there would be about 4,000 people, mostly church leaders from across the city, would come into that. There were some charity organizations. There were also some government organizations who would come in as well, just to hear what we were doing. So we'd do the vision casting meeting, which would be typically a 3-day event, I think, with typically about 4,000 people in it, just working on this, changing the mindset away from church to expanding the kingdom, and talking about what's the kingdom expanding actually looking like.
mm.
When you go into a new area, what does the kingdom look like in that area? How do you um, look at your city, and how do you divide up your city in a way that will give you this sort of targeted approach? So that's what we did. We'd go into places like Lima, do a kickoff meeting with maybe 4,000 people, and then would go back 6 months later, and they would have identified the 400 people, maybe 400-ish people, 500 maybe, who they wanted to pioneer this new approach. So the
And that's
second meeting,
and
yeah,
so one sec. So that's out of the 4,000. There'd be 4 or 500 that would be identified as guys that are going to be able to do this new thing. But
yeah,
these 4,000, where did they come from?
they were church leaders that wanted to hear what was going on.
And what
Um,
was the invitation? Like, what would that sound like?
yeah, it was. I think some of it, when I look back, was because of the year 2000 coming. I think
Okay.
psychologically, people were thinking about the second coming.
Okay.
I don't remember anyone ever saying that,
Yeah.
but I think there was something about that in the mix. You also had, and I'll come back to this later, we also had big American charities sponsoring it.
Okay.
So there was a lot of good publicity, and they also were able to call in um, uh, big speakers as well to these things. So the very first one I went to was actually in Lima. I was due to meet an American in Miami. He didn't show up. So I got on the plane and flew down to Lima, thinking he must be ahead of me. And when I got there, there was a guy with my name on a card, picked me up at the airport, took me to the hotel where the conference briefing was, and sat me next to the conference organizer. We had breakfast, and then this guy stood up and in Spanish spoke to these key leaders. So there'd be 40 people in the room, key leaders from across the city. So I don't understand Spanish, but I understand when someone's giving someone else a hard time. And he was giving
Sure.
them a hard time, I could tell. He was really nailing them. So I said to the conference organizer, "Yeah, who is this guy?" They said, "Oh, this is Alberto Matissi. He's Argentinian. He normally speaks in football stadiums to 80,000, 100,000 people." I said, "Wow, that's amazing. What's he doing here?" "Ah, Alberto, he is the opening night speaker for our 3-day conference." I said, "That's amazing. Who is your main speaker?" And the guy turned and looked at me and he said, "Did you not receive my fax? You are the main speaker." So I'm sitting next to him thinking, holy cow, I thought I was coming to watch my friend speak in this conference. I now find out that I'm the main speaker. That evening, I'm sitting next to Alberto on the stage. 4,000 people come in, and Alberto leans over to me and he said, "Hey, Bob, I have a confession. I said, well, I looked him over. I couldn't see anything wrong with him. I said, what's the problem? He said, tonight I'm feeling a little nervous. And I'm sitting next to him thinking, you haven't seen nerves yet, mate. I've got 3 days to do. So I did 3 days of talking about what we'd learned in our city, how that had influenced our psychology, our way of looking at the Bible, our way of looking at each other, but also the opportunity as well. And then, at the end, everybody stood and everybody came forward and everybody wanted this sort of anointing. We then started training their people, and they would cluster around a table. And so there'd be 400 people around sort of tables sitting in groups. And I'd say to them, okay, what I want you to do is imagine strapping on a parachute. So please stand up. So they all stood up. And I said, help the person in front of you imaginary putting on the parachute, because we are now going to fly you to a new city. And I want you to imagine being parachuted into this new city. Okay, let's just imagine that. So everybody stood up, strapped on the parachutes, checked everybody was okay. We did the airplane bit, we flew around a bit, came back to their tables. Okay, now you're landing. And I said to them, right, you've got 20 minutes. And in that 20 minutes, I want you to decide what you're going to do in the first 3 months of arriving in this brand new city. 20 minutes, off you go. Remember back to my PE lessons. We're trusting the students. So I said to them, 20 minutes, I want you to tell me in 20 minutes what your 3-month strategy is. Blah, 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 blah. They're all talking, da, da, da. Stop. And we got people to stand up. Invariably, what they would say is, number one, we need to research this city. We don't know anything about it. Number two, we need to understand the culture and how these people work. Number three, we need to find out what other resources are in the city that maybe we could use. Okay, I'm going to give you another 20 minutes now, but let me tell you something about your city. It's got 1.2 million people in it. In your imaginary city, it's got a river that crosses through the center. The people to the north are wealthy, people to the south are poorer. There are these new communities that have come into your city and they jostle with everybody else. But there are 20 existing churches. There are 3 government organizations focused on the poor, and there are these charities that are raising money from outside the country to help. Okay, 3 months, 20 minutes. What's your 6-month strategy now? So off they go, talking and coming up with stuff. You get them to stand up and they would say, we need to network the north to the south. We need to get into these poor areas. We need to understand how are they learning our language? How are they learning it? What can we do to help them? We need to network with these churches, and some of them very wealthy, and we could use their resources to come with us to the south. That means we also need to train them in the north to change their mindsets. And then we've got government organizations, which we haven't worked with before, but we need to go sit with them and tell them what our strategy is. I said, stop. I want to tell you something. That imaginary city, 1.2 million people, north and south, river going through the middle, poor areas here, new people coming in. That is Lima. That is your city. We came and we researched your city. So I've got one question for you. Why aren't you doing it? Being Latino, they would burst into tears and realize that all the time they knew what they should be doing, but they'd never articulated it. So basically, all we were doing over the training periods and so on was going in and getting them to reveal what God had already placed in their hearts. We were getting them to articulate it and find out that other people across the table had the same thoughts,
Wow.
but they'd never articulated them. We watched Lima over the next 2 years. They planted 10,000 community groups in 2 years.
Wow. Amazing.
All we did, Joseph, was ask questions.
Yeah. So here's my question. Your first group was in the UK, right? Before you went to Latin America?
Yeah.
What did you notice about the culture of a place? Like, I would guess that Lima or Latin America is more collectivist in nature anyway. They're more around people, they're more social in that sense. But the like Western places could be very individualistic, very bordering. This is my space, don't encroach, and the thought process is very much like if you're coming around my home, you must book your time, right? And so, what did you notice about that? It's like when I look at my country, I look at New Zealand, I know it's very individualistic, very independent. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that's a great observation. So back in the day, you needed to book someone in your Filofax to have an appointment with them 6 months later, you know. Yeah, we're not good at opening our doors and inviting people in. But having said that, we also like friendship.
Mm,
So what we tended to do with young people, for instance, was we took over a multi-story car park from the local government and we turned it into basically a youth club. But it was a youth club where you spoke a lot, and we targeted them with young people from our side who were very, very uh, good at articulating with young people. We slipped a band in there as well, and the band played both Christian music, but could also do the normal music as well. So we found a language that these young people really, really liked.
mm,
And this thing grew to, a couple of hundred people coming in regularly. We would run it twice a week. But the interesting thing was the young people wanted to talk to someone that was just, they may have been, our people may have been 18, 20, 25, but they were just that little bit older. And the young people wanted to pull on their wisdom, wanted to ask them questions that perhaps they couldn't ask their mum and dad.
mm.
In another place, we realized there wasn't a community center to it, and so we opened a coffee shop in there, and the coffee shop became the chill out place. And at different times of the day, you get different communities of people coming into it. But it wasn't just buy a coffee, drink a coffee, and then head out. We'd have enough people there that they'd go and sit with them and talk to them as well. So I think, yeah, in the Western world, it is difficult to build those communities. In Latin America, it's right around the other way, where we would have people say, "Hey, tonight, come to our house. We want to feed you."
Mm.
So we would go into their houses. They'd sit at a long table. They'd feed us. They'd find it incredibly enjoyable to do. We would come out of it knowing that we'd got friends, first name terms. We could go back anytime we wanted. And then our translators would tell us that on the way, whilst we were traveling back, that family had just given us a week's food. They had cooked their week's food for us because they wanted to bless us.
Wow. Amazing.
So it's very, very humbling as well.
Yeah. So this is really good, and I'm so thankful that we're having this conversation, and hopefully you don't mind me just going right in more and more. So here's one of the issues that comes up, right? Who is your covering? If some initiative like this was to begin, a lot of the opposition becomes church organization, institution, going, who is your covering? Who authorized you to do that? Who are you under, to be able to do something like that? What are your thoughts on that? And how would you combat that in a healthy way?
That's a really good question because you're pushing the boundaries. You are on the edge because you're trying to work in two directions at the same time. So you're trying to work into the community and you're trying to transform the church as well. So those sit down times with the church leader for me became really, really important. I just told him stories. Yeah, this is what I'm doing. This is what I'm trying to do. I don't know if it'll work. and to be honest, we became quite radical where we would have people from the standard churches, the Baptists, Pentecostals, and so on, would easily fit with us. But we also brought someone um, from outside that group, from the Catholic Church, and he became part of it as well. And he was intrigued by it because it resonated with something inside him,
Mm,
which is very true to the pure Roman Catholic faith. So he resonated with it. He even allowed me to come into his church and preach in his church.
wow.
So, on the Sunday, I turned up thinking, goodness knows what's going to happen here. So I said to him, I don't even know what to do. He said, it's all right. When I bow, you bow. When I duck my knee, you duck your knee as well. And we made it through. And yeah, we became friends and we'd sit and drink coffee afterwards. And some of the barriers began dissipating. But I think your point of covering is important. So because I was networking, say, 9 key churches, it gave me an excuse to do updates with them. And those 9 leaders would come and we'd have lunch together, say, hey, this is what I'm trying to do. These are the communities we're targeting. This is working well in this community, but we can't get it to work over here. We're still learning. It's not working. So being transparent with them helped. But they also funded it. So they took money out of their accounts and funded the training course. So there's a buy-in on it. That enabled us then to, I think probably 3 times a year, we'd put on a celebration on the work that we'd been doing, and we'd have like 2,000, 3,000 people turn up, mainly from the church, just going,
Wow.
this is good, just to feel part of something that's moving forward.
Wow. That is
Yeah,
so
to me,
interesting.
happened to me in Venezuela as well, that the head of the Baptist Union there wanted me to go to Venezuela and train 300 priests that they're about to ordain to go out into ministry. And he said, look, the training you're doing will be perfect for them because they don't know what they're going to see when they get out there. So I went and did 3 days training with these 300 uh, people that were about to become priests, went through the sort of parachute approach and the 3-month approach and 6-month approach, and talked about how you map your city and so on. On the Friday, the head of the Baptist Union came up to me and he said, Bob, they're getting ordained tonight to become priests, and they have asked that you ordain them. I said, I can't do that. I'm just Bob from Reading, from my city. I've got no status to ordain them. So he looked at me and went, okay, let me come back to you. So I carried on doing the training. We finished, and 5:30 he came up. We've solved it. I said, what do you mean you've solved it? Well, for you to ordain these people to become priests, we figured the best thing is that we'll make you a bishop of Venezuela. So before they get ordained, we will ordain you as a bishop, and then you can ordain them. So
Wow.
they recognize there's a need for coverage, but you have to play right on the boundaries, I think, sometimes.
Yeah. That's very fascinating. I think that's a real challenge here in our
Yeah.
country in New Zealand. Um, but it's
A lot
interesting
of it
because
goes
now
back to a lot of it goes back to that church structure piece that we talked about earlier,
exactly.
and finding ways not to break it, but to sort of work within it to be, a little bit radical, if you like. And that will come down to the strength of the relationship you have with that leadership or that leader as to whether he or she allows you to be that sort of radical.
Yeah. And so what did you have times where it was received and times where it wasn't received, and how did you respond?
Do you know the reception of the idea, the concept was widespread. it didn't really matter which country we went to, which city we went to. It was like God had given us an eye-opening message for
Mm.
that period of time. So we didn't get much pushback. The pushback we did get was from the other side, where there's also witch doctors in those areas, and the witch doctors would pick up on what we were doing and come into the meetings to try to disrupt and so on. And you learned that there's a power that God has to silence even witch doctors, which was quite something. I also went into Argentina just after the Falklands War had been there, and I was up on the stage, and I could feel that there was like an unresolved issue in the room. And, I'm not even close to King Charles or close to the government or anything like that. But I found myself standing on the stage and apologizing to them for the lives lost in the Falklands War
Mm.
and for the waste of human time and effort that we'd put into that for an island that's closer to Argentina than it is to the UK, for sure. And I found myself saying that, thinking, I think it's the right thing. And then from the back of this big church, this huge Argentinian guy stood up and he walked down the aisle towards me. And he was like a bungalow. He was a big guy. And he came and stood up on the platform and he looked at me and through the translator said, I was a soldier fighting on the Falklands War. On behalf of my colleagues, I want to accept your apology.
Wow.
And of course, the church exploded in applause. It was a very, very poignant moment. And then we linked hands and just held them in front of the church and sort of waved from left to right. And the anointing, I don't know what the right words are, the anointing, the pressure, the glory of God came down, and the church was just laid down on the ground. Um, and I think it was just two humans, two Christians going, I'm sorry, we shouldn't have done this. And God honored it.
Wow. Amazing. Man,
So,
there's
yeah,
go for it.
it, it was it was a special time. We also worked over a 8-year period with a, a small church in Bogotá in Colombia. And when we first started working with them and talking about these sort of things, it was relatively small. It just had 2,000 people, which isn't a bad number anyway.
Mm.
But they had a very charismatic leader working there, and we got on very, very well with him. And over the 8-year period, that church grew from 2,000 people to 200,000 people. And so on a Sunday, they had to restrict the number of people that could come to church. So
Mm.
100,000 went into regional groups or home groups or territory groups. The other 100,000 were allowed into church. And the doors of this factory would open. 20,000 people would walk out because they'd just had a service. And then the other doors would open and another 20,000 people would come in. And this was with Cesar Castellanos, who's a well-known speaker, church leader from Bogota,
Mm.
and he mentored me for that period of time. How to stand on the platform, how to present a message, how to then move from the message um, into ministry, how to
Mm.
expect God to turn up. So I had a period of time where I was being mentored by one of the foremost charismatic leaders, probably in the world actually, with the testimony of a church of 200,000 people.
Yeah. Do you feel like the nation that you're in, the region, the territory that you're in would determine what that expression is going to look like?
Say the question again.
The territory or the region or the nation that you're in would determine the expression. Like, for example, in India, a
Yeah,
place like India, there's so many people. There's going to be some very big gatherings, you know. But in a gathering that size, obviously, there is all kinds of other training happening without saying, where you come to sit and learn something, consume, and go. Like, you're not necessarily having to grow up, you know.
yeah, yeah. I think that's true. We're shaped by our culture
Mm,
that we're in. Uh, I was thinking about this during the week leading up to doing this conversation with you. It sounds great because I'm telling you the fascinating stories, the top stories. But let me give you something of the other side of it. I think we made big mistakes when we were talking to these national leaders and the church groups and so on, because touching on what you've just said about the culture that you come from, part of that culture was we were being sponsored by an American organization. The way that they measured their success was the number of churches that were now being planted in those regions. But nobody stopped and redefined what we meant by church. So often, in my opinion, it felt like afterwards that what we'd done is replicated the cultures that would come from, you know, gospel bands, um, a charismatic leader, a preach, a ministry time, a tithing, and then that is church. And then during the week, there'd be a home group or whatever. And if you ask me if you could rerun that time again, I think I would focus more on bringing in the kingdom rather than planting churches. And what I mean by that is when you start thinking through what does a kingdom expansion look like,
mm,
it might have more to do with teaching people to be cooks and feeding the poor than being a pastor and standing at the front of a church. Or it
yeah.
might have more to do with understanding how you witness in the workplace without upsetting people or being pigeonholed into, oh, he's the crazy Christian guy,
Yeah.
and instead actually influencing the ethics.
Well, your internet might have dipped. We're just going to give it a minute. Bob should be back. I hope you're enjoying this conversation. I really am. And this is an important conversation this year, especially in the next 10 to 15 years. This is going to be very, very important. And I'm excited to have more and more of these kind of talks and going back and forth with people that actually do something about things. You know, they're actually moving. And I'm just waiting for Bob to come back. He'll jump back in before I can say this to him also. But I have no interest, especially now, like this year, I feel so good and released. I have no interest in talking to people about kingdom expansion who don't do anything, who have no interest in doing anything. They don't do anything in the community other than try and get people into their building. They don't serve people. They don't want to change community. Like I'm talking to Bob because Bob has walked the road, you know. I care about what Bob has to say and I'll get his input because Bob has walked the path. Bob could be so famous right now. You know, everyone would know him. He could have been a head of a massive ministry, like he's just saying. And most of the people I meet that have done amazing things in the kingdom, they don't even care about who calls them what, you know, because they're actually changing lives. And you and I are called to do that. If you're a believer, you follow Jesus, who's our king, there is a kingdom, you belong to that family, and we change communities. And when you have a church groupie mindset, which a lot of people do, they're afraid because the building keeps them safe. Jesus doesn't keep them safe, the building keeps them safe. It's really hard. And that, I want to talk to Bob about this. Hopefully, he'll come back about how to do more and more and walk this out more and more in this time, you know. So it's really awesome for me to hear that. And I've been part of projects, and I know some of you in the comments have been part of projects of influencing community, and you face pushback usually from the institution because they want you to brand what you're doing under their church name or the franchise of the institution, you know, or ask you who gave you that authority. And so we're in an interesting time right now. And Bob, you're back.
I'm back. Apologies.
No worries. I just want to say a couple of things, right? I was just talking while waiting for you that I I'm talking to Bob because Bob has a track record and he's walked a path, you know. Bob's not just someone with theory and ideas with no action execution, you know. And I was just saying to the guys, like, if you read the comments, that I honor you. You know, I think you would have had many opportunities to become famous and build some kind of platform for Bob. And, you know, but you are just walking with your Father in heaven and walking like Jesus. And there's a whole generation that just want to do that, you know, and want to walk in the reality of this. So I'm so thankful that we're getting to have this kind of conversation and a friendship. And I know that's just the beginning, you know. So,
Yeah, a trigger point for me in that was I was speaking in that big church in Bogotá, 200,000 people, and the pastor was offering me to go and work with him full time. But when I was walking in one day, these these teenagers came up to me with their Bibles, and they wanted me to sign their Bibles like an autograph. And I actually did it because I wasn't thinking. But afterwards, it had more of an impact on me than the service or whatever we were doing inside the building. And I realized that there's a sort of status community out there where you can get onto a um, conference conveyor belt, and you could make a living out of just being a conference speaker. And if you can combine that with uh, miracles as well, of healing or whatever, then your status grows. If
mm,
you can tell stories, your status grows. And I began wondering, why is it that when you get these people with perhaps a healing ministry, why don't they stop what they're doing and teach the 2,000 people in the crowd how they too can access the healing gifts of God and become healers themselves? Why is it they don't multiply themselves?
mm,
Or why is it that a preacher preaches, but he doesn't seem to sit with small groups of people, crowds of people, and say, this is how I understand to get inside the Bible. This is how I prepare my sermon. This is the process to this. Similarly with worship leaders and so on, you can see. And I think for me, what it touched on was a frailty in myself about identity. Who am I? And I could see that having done this for 8 years or whatever, that there was a conveyor belt that I could jump on and travel on and become, the Bob that speaks about city transformation or whatever it might be. I was getting invited to become a consultant to the Church of England
mm.
to transform the way they were looking at their mission. So a lot of these things play in your head and they go, oh, that'd be classy, put that on the CV. But then one day I was stood in Bogota in that big church. I'd just done one service and there was a half-hour break for the next one. And I looked out the window and I saw two people walking down the street carrying briefcases, and they were walking into work. Why they're working on a Sunday, I don't know, but they were walking. And I just realized that I'd never done a proper job. Could I have a foot in the world of church and a foot in business as well? So I came back, I did one of these MBA thing, got myself qualified in business administration. And then I got headhunted into IT. And within a short period of time, I was outside of the church. I was now working in the world of IT, sometimes with small companies, sometimes with very big companies. One of the last ones had 80,000 people as employees. But you start asking yourself a question, okay, so what does it mean to be a Christian in environments like this?
Mm.
And I deliberately chose to go undercover. And I was just very quiet and became good at opening new opportunities. I was involved in a sort of consultancy sales type role. So I'd open up these new opportunities in companies. And the way that I did that, so remembering the PE teacher and
Yes.
parachute thing, was just asking questions in these big companies. So, like in a travel agent, I'd walk in and say in this travel agency, so what would make selling holidays much easier for you? How is the technology that we've got for you? How's that working? The staggering thing was, I was the first person in 10 years that had gone into our retail stores and even asked those questions. And that began, we ended up increasing sales and reducing costs, annual costs by 1.2 million, just
Mm.
by changing the way that we delivered IT to the retail people. But the start of it was asking questions.
Yes.
Um, on another one, we went into our National Health Service, and I just watched people working, the nurses, the doctors working. And what they all had to do was go to 3 PCs that were in each of the wards, and you had to log on. So it's Joseph logging on now. Now it's Bob logging on. Now it's Sarah logging on. But each log on would take 3 minutes. So we went in and we transformed the log on time. So going from 3 minutes, we took it down to like 12 seconds.
Wow.
The interesting thing was the death rate in the hospital fell.
Wow.
Now you're making the staff more productive. They're not
Yeah.
standing around for 3 minutes. They weren't borrowing each other's logons. They weren't cheating the systems. They were just using it properly. 12 seconds, and it saved lives.
Wow.
And
So,
what happened was that, yeah, go on.
well, I just want to translate this language a little bit. So, you, to some extent, you would have felt led, right, by the Lord to move as well into this kind of space. You get an MBA, like you're saying it, like it's a walk in the park. But you got an MBA, and you get headhunted, and you go from an overt assignment to a covert one, and you're in here not trying to make everybody believe what you believe, but you are releasing the kingdom of God there by solving problems that have real life impact, representing
Yeah,
heaven. Is that a fair enough way to say
and
it?
that's a beautiful way of saying it. I wouldn't have thought of that much nicer. But my observation was that afterwards, when you'd won a deal, when you'd transformed something, your mates that you worked with and you'd never spoken about Christianity or anything, you'd typically go out for a meal, celebrate the deal or whatever. They
Mm-hmm.
would start asking questions.
Mm.
Hey, Bob, we've noticed you're really quiet around the place, but you keep coming up with these flipping ideas and it's successful. It's great. Well, what triggered you? I said, oh, do you really want to know? And then it was far better that way round, I think, that they were asking me questions, which gave me permission then to say, well, this is my story. And you
Yeah.
give a little bit of the story.
Yeah. And they can't argue with your story, and they can't argue with your real life results. And I want to just stay on this a
Yeah.
little bit because, firstly, I think it's important to recognize that right from the outset, Bob, you're outside the box. You're like the nicest rebel in a way. You're like a very well mannered, elegant rebel. And so you're challenging status quo. You're getting people to think outside the box. But what's amazing here is in this job, what you're saying to me is you're diligent, you're excellent, you're good at what you do, and so anyone listening at their job who might think that their job is just like a waste of time just to earn some money so that then they can maybe do something for God on a Sunday. Can we touch on that subject a little bit? Why that's not necessarily the case in the kingdom?
Yeah, I mean that's a great question as well. So I've not properly attended church for perhaps I don't know, 6, 8 years. And it's partly because I feel disappointed with it.
Mm,
And with the experiences that I'd had, when you go into a church, you quickly analyze it. You can't help it, you just analyze it. And then I started thinking, actually, most people, most Christians are not going to become full-time church workers, but most of them are going to become full-time workers somewhere. But I can't remember hearing a sermon on how you become an influence in the workplace. Occasionally you'd get wackos standing up and saying, yeah, you just got to say grace before every meal that you have. And you've got to say praise the Lord when something good happens. And you just go, no, I don't think it's that. And so I'd be intrigued if if we could get groups of church leaders to open the doors a bit and allow people to come in and say, this is what it's like sitting in a strategy meeting. This is what it's like being in a finance meeting. This is what it feels like when you've been given a target and it's nearly impossible to achieve. How do we go about doing those things? When we're in front of the clients, what can we do different that would open the doors, both for our organization, but also for ethics to come in, principles to be shining through, and so on. So I think there's a whole opportunity in there in the
mm.
workplace to sort of reconfigure both how we behave in the workplace, but also how we prepare our Christian friends to be effective in that workplace. And then lastly, how we put value on that. Yeah, there's a lot of value given to the worship leader. How do we give value to the head of sales in a technology company, to the
Wow.
head of HR that's dealing with some really crass situations? How do we give value to those people? Say, God's called you to this. How do we say, and there's gifting that will help you? There's stuff that Jesus has for you that will help you. How do we bring that to the surface?
Mm, so good. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of people here in the comments enjoying everything you're saying, Bob. And I think that we are now in a generation because you're watching the switch, right? And
Mm.
I think that the generation after me is just absolutely just not interested in theory. They're like, if you're going to tell me something, show it to me. Don't say it to me, show it to me. And so we got access online, and there are so many things that are not necessarily Christian that are more real, that are bringing more help, that are trying more to actually transform places. And I'm really excited at the thought that believers will get mobilized more and more into this kind of understanding.
Yeah, I'd go back as well and pull out a thread from my story, and that's to do with asking the questions.
Mm.
Do you know that school children, when they go into primary school, young are curious. 80% of them are curious. And then there's studies that have tracked that to the end of secondary school. And the level of curiosity has gone down to maybe 5% of the kids.
So did you say
But
80?
curiosity is good enough. Yeah, it's something like 80% are observed to be curious. They're always asking questions. I've spent time with my 3-year-old grandson, always asking questions, always pushing the boundaries. But sometimes our schools squeeze that out and they
Mm,
do silly things like sit cross-legged and put your finger over your lips.
mm,
I go, why? I want to hear what's going on in that 3-year-old's mind
mm,
because it might open the door to something else.
mm.
But we tend to squash that out. So then you go inside church and you listen to a sermon where they can be very eloquent in giving the answer, but I want to know what the question is.
Yeah.
What's the question we're trying to address with this flipping long sermon you've just been spouting on about? What's the real question? Tell me. What from your life experience are you trying to address in this particular sermon that I
Mm.
could then take that and apply into my life as well? Yeah,
So
so
good.
yeah, sorry.
No, I love it. I love it. And this concept of asking questions and allowing people to grow at their own time and giving people time to wrestle with the tension of not knowing and finding it. It's like we rob ourselves of all of that in this ready-made microwave. Here's the answer, 30-second culture. And I love what you're saying because in a lot of my coaching and the places I'm in, the questions are always the priority, right? Always asking questions. Some people get annoyed at me because I ask them so many questions to ask themselves and think about when they'd rather just me map it out for them, give me my 5 steps, Joseph, and so I really, really love it. And I'm excited and hopeful that we could do some training on this, and just ask more
Yeah.
questions and open up the subject. And
So the phrase that's in my head is we've got to stop starting with the answer and instead start with the questions.
I'm just going to put this in the comments. Stop starting
I was
with answer.
training this team in augmented reality, and I wanted them to learn how to be more efficient, more effective when they're sitting down with a customer.
Mm,
So they were typically in their young 20s, that sort of age. And I'd sit with them and put them in a scenario to say, okay, I am the customer. This is who I am. I work for a travel agency, and I want you to come in and sell me augmented reality. But on the table between me and them, I put a bowl, and in the bowl, there would be marbles. I say, okay, here's the scenario, kick off. And I would say to them, so why is your technology the best? And they'd start talking about it. And I would take one of the marbles, put it in my hand. They'd look at me, and then we'd carry on. I said, so what experience have you got of working with travel agents? And they'd pause, look at each other, and then start giving me the answer. I'd take another marble. After I'd cleared the bowl, I'd say, stop. You go, what do you mean you stopped? Well, I've won all the marbles. What do you mean you've won the marbles? Well, you should have been watching me to figure out when I won. What was I doing that enabled me to pick up a marble? And they reflected on it and realized he picks up a marble every time he asks a question. We didn't ask a single question. We got zero marbles. So then we flipped it around and they redid it. They were asking questions. So I think with the younger generation coming through, we don't need to use old school ways of teaching. We can use some fun things as well that just stimulate people's minds to look at things differently and think differently.
so good. That is so good. So, those of you that are listening, do you have any questions? I'd love to put Bob on the spot with some questions. It's not like you can ever put Bob on the spot because he will throw back a question at you. But if you have any questions, this is the time to put that up. So, Bob, I've been thinking about this concept of migration. All right. And, oh, by the way, have you got time? You got another 15, 20 minutes?
Yeah, no
Yeah.
problem.
Cool. So, Wolfgang Simpson, our good friend, would talk about how you go out of Egypt, right? And you go on this migration into the promised land. And there is a process of coming out of Egypt, but then also Egypt leaving you. There's a thinking that has to change, and you strike me as a man that never really had Egypt thinking so ingrained in the first place, right from at the school, you're looking at students and you're not thinking, okay, this is how I should teach them because that's how I was taught. You were already thinking differently, like a Caleb and a Joshua in a way of that time. What is your advice on how we have this conversation? Because it is going to cause, ripple effects. What are your thoughts on that migration subject that, yeah, you leave Egypt, but then Egypt has to leave you in your thinking, right?
Yeah, so I didn't see it as complex what I was doing. I was literally doing the next thing that I felt God was telling me to do. So I didn't have a big plan. I didn't have a 3-year plan, strategy, anything like that, or this concept of leaving Egypt and going somewhere else. I had no clue about anything like that. I was literally doing what was the next thing that happened in front of me.
Mm,
But I think there's an agreement that you can strike with God. nearly like a contractual agreement. And it goes back to that first experience I had of seeing God heal people, was saying to God, look, I'm willing to step out. I'm willing to leave Egypt, to leave the current way of thinking. But when I feel that I'm on thin ice, I need you to step up. If you're willing to step up, God, I'll step out on that thin ice. But I'm not doing it unless I get a confidence from you that you'll turf up when I need you to turf up.
Mm,
So I think part of it's having this brashness with God, this ability to contract with God to say, okay, I'll have a go at this, but I need you to show up.
mm,
Now, having said that, he doesn't always show up in the way you think, but that's part of the learning experience. But I think having that contractual approach. The other thing I'd say is I think the church gets hung up a lot on the gifts of the Spirit and on ministries as well. So, for instance, when do you need to be an evangelist? Maybe if you happen to be standing in front of a big crowd of people and you're handed the microphone,
sure.
that would make sense.
Yes.
Or if you're in a one-to-one conversation with someone and they're seriously asking questions. So your brain needs to engage with them, but the other part of your brain, wherever that is, has to engage with God as well and say, God, I need those key words. I need, what's the sentence that helps here? What's the phrase? Um, so I think that the gifts and the ministries are more based on circumstance than they are on ability or knowledge.
Mm,
So if you follow that logic through, if you're prepared to have that conversation with God to say, I'm going to step out on the thin ice, then it's God's responsibility to turn up with the healing gift. It's God's responsibility to turn up with the evangelistic gift, with the apostolic gift and stuff. It doesn't belong to me.
mm,
That gifting doesn't belong to me. I'm only prepared to put my feet on the thin ice and trust that God shows up. Whereas I think sometimes in our church teaching, it says you are either one of these or one of these or one of these.
mm,
And I don't think that's true. So there's
mm.
sometimes where, believe it or not, I can be quite pastoral. And there's other times where I can be a teacher.
Yeah.
And it's not that I've changed, it's just the context has changed.
Yes. Yeah. And I totally agree with you. I believe the same, and I've seen it, so many times for years. So yeah. Here's a question: is there a way you can shift the culture from an independent state to a more community interdependent state?
I think so, because that second description of that interdependency sounds more like the kingdom to me.
Mm,
And I think that God's desire is to draw us towards his kingdom with all the attributes of it. So even if you're in a fairly structured culture, let's say at the moment, it must be possible to change it. But you don't need to change the whole thing all in one go. You can change a little bit of it. And what tends to happen then is people look over the wall and say, hey, that looks really good. What is it that you're doing? Oh, we don't do the normal prayer group stuff. We drink coffee. And then invariably someone will start talking about something that's happened to them that week. And we focus on that. And that's fine. So people like coming along because they don't need to um, confess. They don't need to put a story out there. But if they're under real pressure, here's an opportunity to talk about it.
mm, awesome. There's another question. What's one of the biggest challenges that you have faced in your journey, and how did you overcome it?
Yeah. So I told you at the beginning, the reason I became a Christian was um, I needed or was put on the spot about whether I was a Christian or not by the person that I married.
Mm,
And we then had a very good 30-year marriage. But then 10 years ago, we divorced.
mm,
and separated. We just went in different directions. I was focused on the work that I was doing in IT, getting my head around that. My ex-wife was focused on being a deputy head in a secondary school, and our lives went in two different directions.
Mm,
And it got to a point where it wasn't working, it wasn't tolerable. We had four kids. At the time, the youngest of them was in their 20s. And so we made the decision to separate and then divorce.
mm,
So within the relationship, it seemed the right thing to do. Within my relationship with God, I now felt disqualified
mm,
because in my past I'd married people, I'd preached on the sanctity of marriage, I'd yeah, I was full square with what the Bible seemed to be saying about marriage. So when we divorced, I just felt that all the credibility,
mm,
all the anointing that goes with the stories had evaporated. And you talked in the warm up bit about the ultra marathons, these long distance things. One of the reasons that I did that was twofold. One was to beat myself up. There's a sense of I need to punish myself.
wow.
Another part of it was I need to find myself again. And when you're 30 kilometers into a race and there's a hill that shouldn't have been a hill in front of you, and you feel you're either going to die on that corner or certainly on the one after that, it takes you to the bottom of who you really are. You have to dig deep and find out what your motivations are. And so, a long process. I'm now coming out to the other side of that
Mm,
and realizing that that may not have been in God's ideal plan for me, but my kids have recovered well from it.
mm,
My ex-wife has remarried and is very happy. Um, and I'm getting to a point now where I'm feeling that I'm ready to contribute again. So that's hence doing today with you guys as well is yeah, I think I might still have something to contribute.
mm. Wow. Thank you for being real and vulnerable. It's should be more common in our spheres, but it's not as common. So this leads me to a question because I have met a few people who have felt that same disqualification and they almost get stuck and stagnant, almost feeling like, well, I prayed before I got married and I know it was the Lord and the presence of God was so strong at the wedding. How could we end up here 5 years later, 6 years later? And now I'm stuck. And how could I ever do anything for God now if I blew that thing? And it's the most important thing. Like, can you give some advice to anyone struggling with that, almost being like stuck in the spot now, feeling like there's no hope? Okay, I think Bob's frozen. All right, Bob, you're back. Here we go. Round three, our last round. So, yeah, I was just asking the question on what advice would you have for someone who's stuck because they've been through something like that?
Yeah, there's a lot of pressure that comes on for sure because there's the reality of the situation. There's a lot of pressure to it. There's invariably blame within that as well, and both the blame that you might give to your partner, but there's also a blame that you give to yourself for enabling that to happen. But there's also, um, you know, the enemy takes advantage of it as well. And so you feel pressures that come from sort of outside of the reality as well. And it's hard to sometimes distinguish between what is God chastising you over, and then what is the enemy putting his boot in on. So for me, it's been a 10-year process of going through that and beginning to come out the other side.
Mm. Wow. I'd love to hear any advice you have for people that are single, right? Wanting to get married and are maybe a bit older. And then also any advice you have for people that are married, maybe 5 to 10 years in, and are finding it challenging. Maybe the wife and the husband are not on the same page. Just any thoughts you have on that?
Hey, Joseph, the deal was that I'd come in and talk about city transformation.
Oh, yeah.
And
Okay. Yeah.
you're now getting me to resolve the problems of the world.
Yeah. No, I don't. I'm not trying to put you on the spot. The conversation went that
No,
way, so I don't
I
know.
know, I'm teasing.
Okay, I'm
Um,
glad you're joking. Whoa.
when it comes down to it, it's all about communication, isn't it?
Hmm.
Having deep conversations or real conversations. And if I look back 15 years ago, we stopped talking.
Hmm.
We stopped conversing on a real level, and that accelerated our slide away from each other. So if I was single again or talking to a single person, I think sitting down with your potential partner and just talking as deep as you can about priorities in your life, your values, your ethics. I mean, there's so much now on the internet that would fast track a young person into a sexual relationship. Um, that's really difficult to handle because suddenly you're getting the the, the, the chocolate cake, the top part of a relationship without having put any foundations in place.
Hmm.
And so it's really difficult then to handle stuff when things start going wrong.
Hmm.
So if suddenly you find out something about someone, you're going to walk away. You know, I'm certainly not going to let you touch me.
Hmm.
But had you been able to spend longer, talking about values and your ethics, where you see your life going in 15 years time, you know, what is it that makes you tick? Maybe it wouldn't get to that stage. And for people at the other side who've been married for 5 years or more, sometimes children come along and priorities change, and actually you don't have time and space to do stuff, to spend quiet time together or just have a decent conversation together. I think maybe if you've got parents around or you've got good friends around, just asking them, can you look after our kids for a morning? And then having a really good conversation would help. So, what's really going on in the workplace? What is work like for you? What makes you tick? Where do you imagine being in 5 years' time once the kids have grown up a little bit more? Having time and space to have those proper conversations would
Hmm.
invariably help, I think.
That's so good. So good. Well, thank you for letting me ask that question. And it just sparked a little bit of PTSD in me because I had one very interesting episode with someone a while back where they just flipped on me in a live stream. So, um, yeah. Bob, I really honor you. I thank you for your time and I love what you carry. There's a whole generation ready to receive what you carry and implement it. And I believe we just began that conversation today, and
Yeah,
I'm really, really excited for what's to come in the next 5 to 10 years. And I just want to thank you. Thank you so much for your time. And if somebody wants to reach out to you or connect with you, what's the best way for them to do that?
just through you. You've got my contact details. That would be
Yeah,
fine.
yeah. Okay, so
Yeah.
contact me and I'll connect you to Bob. Any last words, Bob, as we wrap this up?
I love having this conversation with you as well, Joseph, because 6 weeks ago when we first connected, it felt so natural, so very easy to talk. Um, so for me, it's a privilege to spend time with you guys, and would be happy to be involved in whatever way you want going forward as well. Um, just been great. Love it. Thank you.
Amazing. Well, there you go, guys. Hope you enjoyed that. Bless you. We've had 2 amazing episodes this week, and there's many more to come. So for now, Bob, you stay with me. Everyone else, we're going to say goodbye, and I will see you on the next one.